Long before the name Medici became synonymous with power, art, and quiet domination, Florence was already a city trembling with ambition. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, it was not a kingdom, nor an empire, but a restless republic built on commerce, competition, and credit. Narrow streets echoed with the noise of looms and markets, while towering stone palazzi rose like fortresses, signaling that wealth in Florence was not merely possessed, it was defended. Political life was volatile, shaped by rival factions, sudden exiles, and periodic violence that reminded every citizen how fragile order truly was. In this unstable environment, money was not simply a tool of trade, it was the most reliable form of power available. Florence's prosperity rested on banking and textiles, industries that required trust across borders at a time when trust was scarce. Merchants needed systems to move capital without physically transporting gold, and bankers learned that influence flowed most efficiently through debt. The city's ruling elites were not crowned monarchs but families whose fortunes allowed them to shape elections, sponsor militias, and determine which laws were enforced and which were ignored. Yet these families were also vulnerable. Wealth attracted envy, and visibility invited destruction. To survive in Florence was to master discretion as much as ambition. It was into this environment that the Medici family quietly emerged. They were not ancient nobility, nor celebrated warriors. Their origins were provincial and unremarkable, rooted in the Mugello countryside north of Florence. Early Medici generations were minor landholders and small-scale money changers, navigating a city already dominated by more prestigious banking dynasties such as the Bardi and the Peruzzi. These older houses operated vast international networks and financed kings and popes, believing their scale made them invincible. The Medici observed, learned, and waited. The turning point came in the aftermath of catastrophe. In the 1340s, Florence was shaken by a series of crises that reshaped its social and financial order. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, triggered by massive unpaid royal debts most notably from Edward III of England, sent shockwaves through Europe. Almost overnight, Florence learned that even the greatest fortunes could evaporate when political power failed to honor financial obligations. This lesson would define the Medici approach to money for generations to come. At the same time, the Black Death tore through the city, killing nearly half the population. Entire lineages disappeared, properties changed hands, and labor shortages disrupted traditional hierarchies. Amid death and fear, opportunity emerged for those willing to adapt. Surviving families found themselves with access to abandoned assets and a desperate market for financial stability. The Medici did not rise; despite this chaos they rose, because they understood it. Giovanni di Bixi de' Medici, born in 1360, embodied this new mentality. He was cautious where others were reckless, pragmatic where rivals sought glory. Rather than lending enormous sums to monarchs who could default without consequence, Giovanni focused on diversified, smaller-scale operations spread across multiple regions. He cultivated relationships instead of dependence, and above all, he avoided drawing attention to himself. In Florence, humility could be a form of camouflage. Giovanni's greatest strategic decision was aligning the Medici Bank with the papacy. By becoming the primary bankers to the Roman Curia, the Medici secured not only immense financial flows but unparalleled political protection. Papal accounts required discretion, speed, and international reach, and the Medici delivered all three. Through this relationship, they gained access to information, influence over appointments, and moral legitimacy in a deeply religious society. Money, when laundered through the church, acquired a sacred aura. Yet Giovanni resisted the temptation to translate wealth directly into overt political power. Unlike other families who sought high office aggressively, he understood the resentment that visible dominance provoked. Instead, he positioned the Medici as indispensable but unobtrusive, a family whose services were necessary to the functioning of Florence, but whose ambitions appeared modest. This was not weakness, it was strategy. By the time Giovanni died in 1429, the foundations of Medici dominance were firmly in place, though few Florentines fully recognized it. The family controlled vast financial networks, enjoyed papal favor, and had cultivated a reputation for reliability rather than arrogance. Most importantly, They had learned how to convert money into loyalty without appearing tyrannical. Florence remained a republic in name, but its future was already being shaped behind the scenes. The stage was set for a transformation unlike any Europe had yet witnessed. From these quiet beginnings would emerge a dynasty that would finance art, manipulate elections, crown popes, and reshape the cultural identity of an entire continent. The Medici story did not begin with brilliance or grandeur. It began with restraint, patience, and an understanding that in a world of uncertainty, the most powerful hand is the one that moves unseen. At this point, the Medici were still bankers, nothing more. But Florence was about to learn that money, when wielded with intelligence and timing, could command not just markets, but minds, cities, and history itself. When Giovanni di Bixi died in 1429, Florence did not witness a dramatic transfer of power. There were no public ceremonies, no declarations of dominance, no banners announcing a new ruling house. And yet, beneath the familiar rituals of republican life, authority had already begun to consolidate around a single figure. Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's eldest son, inherited not only the most sophisticated banking network in Europe, but also his father's most valuable lesson in Florence: power survived only when it appeared reluctant. Cosimo lived in a city that defined itself by the absence of kings. The Florentine Republic prided itself on civic participation, rotating offices, and the ideal of collective governance. Yet this political structure was vulnerable to manipulation precisely because it relied on informal influence. Elections were guided by patronage, committees were shaped by personal alliances, and laws could be enforced selectively. Cosimo understood that Florence did not need a ruler, it needed a coordinator, and he was prepared to become one. Unlike the flamboyant oligarchs of earlier generations, Cosimo cultivated an image of moderation. He dressed plainly, lived without ostentation, and presented himself as a loyal citizen rather than a master. But behind this carefully constructed humility was a financial apparatus capable of shaping every major decision in the city. Through loans, favors, and quiet interventions, Cosimo placed allies in key magistracies and ensured that rivals found themselves isolated, indebted, or politically irrelevant. The Medici Bank did not simply finance Florence, it lubricated its political machinery. This growing influence did not go unnoticed. By the early 1430s, opposition to the Medici began to crystallize around rival elites who feared that Cosimo's power threatened the Republic's autonomy. Chief among them was the Albizzi faction, an established political family determined to curb Medici influence before it became irreversible. In 1433, they struck decisively. Cosimo was arrested, accused of seeking tyranny, and exiled from Florence. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Republic had saved itself. Yet Cosimo's exile revealed the true extent of Medici power. From Venice, he continued to operate his banking network, redirecting credit away from Florence and toward rival cities. Trade slowed, liquidity vanished, and confidence collapsed. Merchants complained. Artisans suffered. Political leaders realized that without Medici capital, Florence could not function as it once had. Within a year, Cosimo was recalled not as a conqueror, but as a necessity. His return in 1434 marked a turning point in European political history. Cosimo did not abolish republican institutions. Instead, he hollowed them out from within. Opponents were exiled legally. Committees were restructured procedurally. Elections continued formally, but their outcomes became increasingly predictable. Florence remained a republic in appearance, but in practice it had acquired something new: a ruler without a crown. Cosimo's genius lay in understanding that legitimacy in Renaissance Italy was not derived solely from force. It was cultivated through culture. He became one of history's first great patrons, transforming art and architecture into instruments of political stability. Under his sponsorship, Florence experienced an unprecedented cultural flowering. Architects such as Filippo Brunelleschi, sculptors like Donatello, and scholars of classical antiquity all found support through Medici patronage. These works were not acts of vanity, they were investments in civic pride. Buildings rose that embodied harmony, proportion, and balance, values that Cosimo wished to associate with his leadership. The Medici Palace itself, designed by Michelozzo, was deliberately restrained, its exterior fortress-like yet dignified, signaling strength without provocation. Inside, however, it housed one of the most sophisticated intellectual circles in Europe. Cosimo funded the translation of ancient Greek texts, supported humanist scholars, and helped revive Platonic philosophy through figures like Marsilio Ficino. Florence became not merely wealthy, but enlightened. This cultural strategy achieved something extraordinary. It transformed Medici dominance into a shared achievement. Citizens could resent political manipulation, but they took pride in Florence's beauty, learning, and prestige. The Medici became inseparable from the city's identity. To oppose them was to risk opposing Florence itself. Internationally, Cosimo leveraged diplomacy with the same subtlety he applied at home. He financed allies, mediated conflicts, and positioned Florence as a stabilizing force in Italy's volatile balance of power. His influence extended into Rome, Milan, and beyond, not through armies, but through debt and negotiation. The Medici Bank became an unofficial ministry of foreign affairs. Yet this system carried an inherent contradiction. It depended entirely on Cosimo's personal judgment, restraint, and credibility. There were no laws to guarantee its continuity, no institutions capable of replicating his balancing act. Power had become personalized. Stability rested on a single man's ability to remain indispensable without appearing dominant. By the time of Cosimo's death in 1464, Florence mourned him publicly, calling him Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. It was an extraordinary title for a man who had never officially ruled. The Republic remained intact on paper, but its soul had shifted. Florence had accepted a new political reality, one in which money, culture, and quiet control mattered more than constitutional purity. Cosimo left behind a city transformed, a dynasty legitimized, and a dangerous precedent. His successors would inherit immense power, but not his restraint. The system he created could elevate Florence to unmatched heights or accelerate its descent into autocracy and excess. The question was no longer whether the Medici ruled Florence. The question was how long they could rule without becoming what they had once claimed to oppose. Cosimo de' Medici had constructed a system that appeared stable because it was subtle. But subtlety, once inherited, rarely survives intact. When power passes from a founder to his descendants, it carries not only wealth and influence, but expectation. The Medici were no longer merely bankers among citizens. They had become a dynasty whose authority rested on memory, reputation, and the continuing flow of money. And it was money, its expansion, distortion, and eventual fragility that would shape the next chapter of their story. Cosimo was succeeded by his son, Piero di Cosimo de' Medici, known to history as Piero the Gouty. Physically frail and often confined by illness, Piero lacked his father's stamina and patience. Yet his weakness was deceptive. Politically, he proved capable of ruthless decisiveness when threatened. Where Cosimo preferred to neutralize opponents quietly, Piero confronted them directly. In doing so, he altered the tone of Medici rule. Power became more visible, and visibility invited resistance. Florence in the mid-15th century was no longer a city discovering Medici dominance. It was a city adjusting to it. Republican institutions still functioned, but increasingly as rituals devoid of genuine choice. This erosion of political participation did not immediately provoke rebellion, but it reshaped elite behavior. Families once willing to negotiate now plotted. Alliances hardened. Politics became less flexible, more brittle. The Medici system, built on balance, began to lose its elasticity. The Medici Bank, still the backbone of the dynasty, expanded aggressively during this period. Branches in Rome, Milan, Bruges, London, and Geneva connected Florence to the arteries of European commerce. The bank's relationship with the papacy was particularly lucrative, granting the Medici both prestige and leverage. Yet expansion carried risk. Loans to monarchs were rarely repaid in full. Political favor could evaporate with a single change of regime. What had once been a carefully diversified enterprise increasingly depended on unstable clients and personal relationships. This vulnerability became more pronounced under Piero's son, Lorenzo de' Medici, later known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Ascending to power in 1469, Lorenzo inherited not only a vast fortune and political machine, but a city whose expectations had grown dangerously high. Florence wanted stability, prosperity, and glory. Lorenzo understood instinctively that he must provide all three, even if the foundations beneath them were weakening. Lorenzo was not a banker by temperament. He was a poet, a diplomat, and a cultural impresario. Where his grandfather had used art to legitimize power, Lorenzo transformed patronage into spectacle. Under his guidance, Florence became the beating heart of the Renaissance. Artists such as Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo flourished under Medici protection. Literature, philosophy, and science found a home in his circle. The city dazzled Europe. But magnificence is expensive. Lorenzo's cultural spending far outpaced the bank's capacity to sustain it. Rather than reinvesting in financial discipline, he diverted funds to maintain appearances and political loyalty. The Medici Bank began to falter not suddenly, but steadily. Mismanagement, corruption, and unpaid debts accumulated. Branches closed. Profits shrank. The dynasty's symbolic capital soared, even as its economic capital eroded. This imbalance became dangerously apparent in 1478, with the Pazzi conspiracy. A rival banking family, supported by disgruntled nobles and elements within the papacy, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Mass in Florence Cathedral. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo survived, wounded but resolute. The response was swift and brutal. Conspirators were executed publicly. Their bodies were displayed as warnings. Florence rallied around Lorenzo, not out of constitutional loyalty, but emotional shock. The aftermath of the conspiracy marked a critical transformation. Medici rule, once cloaked in Republican language, became openly coercive. Surveillance increased. Dissent was punished more harshly. The line between protector and ruler blurred beyond recognition. Lorenzo justified these measures as necessary for stability, and many citizens accepted them. Fear, after all, can be a powerful substitute for consent. Internationally, Lorenzo proved himself an extraordinary diplomat. He navigated wars, negotiated peace between rival Italian states, and positioned Florence as a mediator rather than a conqueror. His personal charisma compensated for structural weakness. Yet this too was fragile. Diplomacy, like banking, depends on trust, and trust cannot be inherited indefinitely. When Lorenzo died in 1492, Florence lost not just a leader, but a linchpin. His heirs lacked his political instinct and cultural authority. The bank was near collapse. The city, long insulated by Medici influence, faced external pressure and internal disillusionment. Into this vacuum stepped new voices, most notably the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, whose sermons denounced Medici corruption, moral decay, and the excesses of Renaissance culture itself. Savonarola's rise revealed how profoundly Florence had changed. The same citizens who once celebrated Medici magnificence now questioned its cost. Bonfires of the vanities consumed artworks, books, and luxury goods, symbols of a world that suddenly seemed hollow. In 1494, the Medici were expelled from Florence. Their palaces were looted, their names cursed. The dynasty that had ruled without titles was overthrown without a battle. Yet even in exile, the Medici were not finished. Their wealth was diminished, but their networks endured. Their influence shifted from banking halls to ecclesiastical corridors. Within decades, they would return to Florence not as subtle patrons, but as dukes, backed by papal authority and imperial force. The transformation was complete. What began as financial manipulation had evolved into hereditary rule. The tragedy of the Medici lies not in their ambition, but in its success. They proved that money could reshape politics, culture, and belief itself. But in doing so, they created a system dependent on constant expansion and performance. When the illusion faltered, the structure collapsed. Florence gained beauty, knowledge, and prestige, but lost the republic it once claimed to defend. The Renaissance, so often remembered as an age of rebirth, was also an age of consolidation. Behind its art and philosophy stood ledgers, debts, and calculated risks. The Medici did not merely fund the Renaissance. They monetized it. And in the process, they revealed a truth that would echo across centuries: when money governs culture and power hides behind generosity, the cost is eventually paid not in coin, but in freedom. Exile did not humble the Medici. It clarified them. Stripped of Florence, stripped of the illusion that subtlety alone could preserve their dominance, the family adapted with cold precision. Banking had once been their engine, art their disguise, and republican ritual their shield. Now, in the aftermath of their expulsion, they identified a different lever of control, one older, deeper, and far more resilient than money alone, the authority of the church. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a period of profound instability across Europe. Kingdoms waged war, city-states collapsed, and the papacy itself had become entangled in secular ambition. For the Medici, this chaos was not a threat but an opportunity. While Florence experimented with fragile republican revival under Savonarola and later unstable civic councils, the Medici repositioned themselves within Rome, where power was centralized, spiritual legitimacy was absolute, and memory could be rewritten. The turning point came with Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Unlike his father, Giovanni had been groomed not for politics or finance, but for the church. Appointed a cardinal at the age of 13, his rise was emblematic of Medici strategy in its new form. Ecclesiastical advancement was no longer merely a prestige project, it was a pathway back to temporal rule. In 1513, Giovanni ascended the papal throne as Pope Leo X, marking a decisive transformation in Medici identity. Leo X ruled the papacy not as a spiritual shepherd, but as a Renaissance prince. Rome under his reign became an extension of Medici. Florence lavish, cultured, and unapologetically indulgent. Art flourished again, funded by the vast resources of the church. Raphael, Bramante, and Michelangelo worked under papal patronage. Yet beneath the surface, the same structural weaknesses that had plagued the Medici Bank now infected the Vatican's finances. Excessive spending, political favoritism, and reliance on questionable revenue streams, most notably the sale of indulgences, created moral and economic fault lines that would soon fracture Christendom itself. Ironically, Leo X's papacy contributed directly to the Protestant Reformation. His financial policies, designed to sustain grandeur and consolidate power, provoked Martin Luther's rebellion in 1517. The Medici had once destabilized Florence through monetary manipulation, now they destabilized Europe through spiritual commodification. The scale had changed, but the pattern remained hauntingly consistent. Meanwhile, Florence did not remain independent for long. With papal authority and imperial alliances behind them, the Medici orchestrated their return. In 1512, aided by Spanish troops and papal pressure, they re-entered the city. This time, there would be no pretense of republican balance. Power was imposed, not negotiated. Resistance was crushed. Institutions were reshaped to ensure permanence rather than flexibility. The final seal on Medici dominance came in 1537, when Cosimo I de' Medici, distant relative, but ideological heir, assumed control after the assassination of Duke Alessandro de' Medici. Cosimo was young, underestimated, and astonishingly effective. He centralized authority, dismantled remaining republican structures, and transformed Florence into the capital of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. The Medici were no longer hidden rulers. They were sovereigns by title, by force, and by international recognition. Architecture reflected this shift. The Palazzo Vecchio became a ducal fortress rather than a civic symbol. The Uffizi was constructed not merely as an administrative center, but as a visual manifesto of centralized power. Even urban space was reorganized to reflect hierarchy and surveillance. The city that had once celebrated civic participation now embodied obedience and spectacle. Yet this victory carried a quiet tragedy. The Medici, having achieved absolute rule, lost the adaptability that had once ensured their survival. Their later generations governed competently but cautiously. Innovation slowed. The dynasty endured for centuries, but without the disruptive energy that had propelled its rise. Florence remained beautiful, stable, and culturally significant, but no longer revolutionary. The Medici story thus completes its arc, not in collapse, but in normalization. What began as a financial experiment evolved into political manipulation, religious authority, and finally hereditary monarchy. Each transformation solved an immediate problem while creating a deeper long-term cost. The Renaissance they fueled reshaped Europe, but the republic they hollowed out was never restored. In the end, the Medici did not simply dominate their age, they defined a model of power that would echo into the modern world. The fusion of capital, culture, and legitimacy remains a blueprint still recognizable today. Their legacy is not only written in marble and paint, but in systems that continue to shape how influence is acquired, disguised, and preserved. And Florence, once a city of citizens, became a stage upon which power learned to dress itself as destiny. By the late 16th century, the Medici had achieved what their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. From wool traders and bankers, they had become grand dukes, popes, and kingmakers. Florence, once a volatile republic driven by guilds and civic debate, was now a stable hereditary state. To many contemporaries, this appeared to be the family's final triumph, a victory of endurance, strategy, and historical inevitability. But power, once secured, carries a different kind of burden. It no longer needs to be seized. It must be maintained. And that task proved far more corrosive than the struggle to rise. Cosimo I's successors inherited a realm that was orderly, centralized, and internationally recognized, yet subtly hollowed out. The Medici state depended heavily on bureaucratic control, military enforcement, and symbolic grandeur rather than innovation. Florence remained artistically refined, but it no longer led Europe intellectually or economically. The restless experimentation that had defined the early Renaissance faded into ritualized patronage and ceremonial excess. Creativity became preservation. Stability replaced ambition. The later Medici rulers Francesco I, Ferdinando I, and their descendants governed competently, but without vision. Trade routes shifted away from the Mediterranean toward the Atlantic world, marginalizing Tuscany's economic relevance. The banking innovations that once gave the Medici their edge were obsolete. Their wealth now depended on taxation, land rents, and dynastic alliances, rather than financial ingenuity. The family that once shaped markets now merely reacted to them. Ironically, it was culture, not money or politics, that preserved the Medici name long after their influence waned. Their vast art collections, scientific patronage, and architectural legacy became their most enduring contribution. The Uffizi Gallery, originally an administrative building, evolved into one of the world's greatest repositories of Renaissance art. The Medici supported figures like Galileo Galilei, not out of pure idealism, but because knowledge itself had become a symbol of authority. Even science was folded into the performance of power, yet beneath the marble facades and curated legacy lay decay. Dynastic marriages, often arranged to secure alliances, led to inbreeding and fragile heirs. Political relevance diminished as larger nation-states France, Spain, and later Britain came to dominate European affairs. By the 18th century, the Medici were rulers in name, but no longer architects of history. The end came quietly. In 1737, with the death of giant Gaston de' Medici, the dynasty ended without an heir. There was no revolution, no dramatic collapse, no symbolic reckoning. Power simply moved on. Tuscany passed to the House of Lorraine under international agreement. The Medici, who had once bent systems to their will, were now subject to the very geopolitical forces they could no longer influence. And yet, their story did not end in irrelevance. It transformed into something more unsettling: permanence without power. The Medici legacy became institutionalized, embedded in museums, cityscapes, academic narratives, and the romantic mythology of the Renaissance itself. Their domination faded, but their imprint became invisible, normalized, and therefore more powerful in memory than in reality. The true lesson of the Medici is not that money corrupts, or that art redeems, or even that power inevitably declines. It is that influence rarely disappears, it changes form. The mechanisms pioneered by the Medici, financial leverage disguised as public good, cultural patronage used as moral camouflage, legitimacy borrowed from tradition and faith, remain foundational to modern systems of power. Corporations, political dynasties, and cultural institutions still operate along pathways the Medici helped design. Florence today stands as both monument and warning. Its beauty is undeniable. Its harmony is deliberate. But beneath the surface lies a history of manipulation, exclusion, and controlled memory. The Medici did not merely shape a city or an era. They demonstrated how power learns to survive by becoming invisible, and perhaps that is their greatest achievement and their darkest legacy. If this story has revealed anything, It is that history's most influential families rarely rule through force alone. They rule through systems, symbols, and stories that endure long after the rulers themselves are gone. The Medici remind us that behind every golden age lies a hidden structure of control, compromise, and consequence. If you found this journey through power, art, and ambition meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel to continue exploring the untold histories behind the world's most influential dynasties. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you believe the Medici advanced civilization more than they constrained it? Or was their brilliance inseparable from the cost they imposed on Florence and Europe? Your perspective becomes part of the ongoing conversation that history itself can never finish.